Last month, I was having dinner in Brussels with an old friend, a mid-level bureaucrat who spent his entire career championing the European social model. He spent the first half of the meal leaning back, wine glass in hand, lecturing me on how America lacked a civilized safety net and was obsessed with senseless growth. He looked comfortable, almost smug, as he spoke about the dignity of their managed economy. But then the check arrived. I watched his eyes dart to the total, then quickly to his banking app, a tiny flash of panic crossing his face before he masked it with a weary sigh about the cost of energy. He started complaining, not about the meal, but about his 50% tax bracket and how his generous state pension felt more like a ghost story, something he had heard of but would never actually touch. The real shift, however, happened when I showed him a headline on my phone about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act back home, specifically the part about making overtime and tips entirely tax-free. He didn't scoff. He didn't offer a rebuttal about social equity. He just stared at the screen for a long, silent minute, his grip tightening on his glass. He finally whispered, "You're actually letting the workers keep it. All of it." It wasn't the reaction of a man who felt protected by his government. It was the look of someone realizing he was trapped in an open-air museum while the rest of the world moved on. That instantaneous shift from intellectual superiority to profound, quiet envy really stayed with me. It made me realize that OBBA isn't just a collection of tax codes or fiscal tinkering. It's a formal withdrawal from a civilizational suicide pact that much of the West has already signed. While Europe is currently performing a dress rehearsal for collapse suffocating its drivers to fund a shrinking welfare state, America has reached a crossroads. We are deciding right now if we want to follow Pierre into that comfortable decline, or if we still have the grit to reward the hustle, that opening story, that moment of panic, and then just pure envy. It really does capture the massive shift that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act represents.
It really does.
OBBA, as everyone calls it, signed into law July 4th, 2025. It's a Leviathan. Public Law 11921. And to really get it, you have to look past the headlines.
Way past them.
So that's our mission in this deep dive. We want to get into the mechanics of the law to really grasp the philosophical break it represents, how it completely redefines American labor, capital, industrial strategy, especially when you hold it up against, the European model. We want to give you the shortcut to understanding where America is headed now.
Exactly. And you said it right there. This is not just a budget bill. It's a complete framework for a radically different vision of the country.
Okay, so how should we break this down for everyone?
Well, to give you the clearest view, I think we need to look at it through three different lenses. They're all connected, of course.
Go on.
First, we have to look at rewarding the worker. This is the most visible part. The tax-free tips, the tax-free overtime. It's an economic catalyst meant to directly counter that labor stagnation you see in Europe.
The high taxes that just kill the incentive to take an extra shift.
Precisely. Then second, we'll dive into the strategic defense of capital. This is about how the bill protects middle-class assets, with tax credits and deductions, actively pushing back against those redistributive models.
Shoring up the foundations.
And finally, we have to talk about industrial sovereignty. This is the big geopolitical piece, the move away from degreening, the focus on cheap energy. It's all about making sure American industry can compete.
That is the perfect roadmap, and it starts right where my dinner story left off with the worker. So let's jump right in. Segment 1. Rewarding the worker, the idea behind this tax-free hustle. So the core idea here feels almost old-fashioned in a way, the philosophy of incentive.
It is. It's a very direct bet that if you let people keep more of what they earn from extra effort, they'll simply do more extra effort.
It's a direct challenge to those systems where, you work an extra 10 hours and half of it disappears before you even see it. It almost feels like a penalty for working harder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's important to understand this didn't just appear out of nowhere. There was a very specific economic backdrop that drove this.
Right, the political pressure.
Huge pressure. The source material we looked at highlights that real compensation per hour had actually declined by 5.2% during the previous administration.
Declined, not just stagnated.
It declined, which is the worst performance we've seen since the end of World War II. When you're facing a historical failure of that magnitude, the political imperative is to deliver something immediate, something tangible for working people.
And supporters would contrast that with, the previous Trump term?
Right. They constantly point to the 12.8% growth in real compensation per hour during that first term. So you see the narrative they built. It was presented as an urgent mandate to get back to that growth and to do it in the way that people could feel in their pockets right away.
Okay, so if the goal is immediate, tangible results, the no tax on tips provision is the big, shiny object. So let's talk about the mechanism. How does it actually work?
Okay, so the mechanism is a new tax deduction. It's temporary, set to expire at the end of 2028, and it's for what they call qualified tips.
With a cap, I assume?
Yes, a cap of $25,000 per year. But, and this is really the most important detail for you to understand, the term tax-free is a bit of a marketing term.
A loophole, you mean?
Well, it's a deduction against your federal income tax liability only. This is crucial. The FICA taxes, that's your Social Security, Medicare, they still apply to every single dollar.
So your tips are not really tax-free, they're just exempt from one specific tax.
Exactly. That's a massive distinction.
Yeah.
If you're in the 22% federal bracket, you save that 22%, but you are still paying that 7.65% FICA tax. We have to be really clear on that.
Okay, so who gets this benefit? Who qualifies?
It's clearly targeted. The full deduction is for individual workers earning less than $150,000 a year, and then there's a phase-out, so it's completely gone, for joint filers making over $300,000.
So it's aimed squarely at the working and middle class.
Yes, the goal is to reward the service worker, not some highly paid executive who might get a tip in a weird niche situation.
And are we just talking about waiters and bartenders here, or is it broader?
Oh, it's remarkably broad. I mean, the Treasury's initial list had something like 68 different job categories.
68?
Yeah, we're talking waitstaff, bartenders, sure, but also chefs, barbers, hairdressers, tattoo artists.
Rideshare drivers?
Taxi and rideshare drivers, absolutely. Even golf caddies. The goal was clearly to cast a very wide net across the entire modern service and gig economy.
So what's the fine print on a qualified tip? I imagine they had to be careful to stop people from just calling any cash payment a tip.
They were. The rules are pretty strict. The tip has to be paid voluntarily by the customer, and the customer has to be the one who determines the amount.
Ah, so that excludes a lot of things.
It immediately excludes things like mandatory auto gratuities, for large parties, or those service charges some places add on. Anything that's negotiated or mandatory is out. They're trying to make sure this only rewards the traditional definition of a gratuity for good service.
Okay, so if you're one of those 68 job types and you qualify an income, what's the actual bottom line benefit the government is projecting?
The estimates are pretty specific. They expect this will boost the average take-home pay for an eligible tipped worker by about $1,300 a year.
$1,300, that's not nothing.
It's a measurable financial bump. But the government also sold this as a benefit to small businesses. They argued it would help with employee retention.
How so?
Well, replacing a tipped employee can cost a small business around $8,000 when you factor in everything. So the argument is, if this deduction helps you keep your staff, it's a stability measure for the employer too. It's like the government is subsidizing a little piece of the worker's income to keep them in the job.
It sounds good, but there's always a but. I know critics immediately found a massive contradiction in this policy.
And it is the policy's greatest flaw. The data shows that nearly 37% of all tipped workers in the U.S. already pay zero federal income tax.
37%, so over a third.
Over a third of the target demographic gets absolutely no benefit from this at all. Their income is just too low. A deduction against a tax you don't pay is worthless.
So this is really a benefit for the highest earning tipped workers.
Okay.
The ones who are already in the 12% or 22% tax bracket.
That's exactly who it helps, which of course immediately raises questions about fairness and structural inequality.
Right. Why is the tax code now favoring a bartender making 80 grand a year over, say, an elementary school teacher making 50?
That was the immediate criticism. An elementary school teacher, a hospital orderly, a cashier, they all work hard. They're in a similar income bracket, but they work on a fixed wage. They get nothing.
So what did the opponents propose instead?
They argued that if you really want to help low-income workers, the more equitable way is to just increase the guaranteed minimum wage for everyone. That provides stability. This deduction, they argue, is volatile and only helps a specific subset of workers.
And that stability argument is really key, isn't it? The whole problem with the tipping system is that your income is completely unpredictable.
Absolutely. One slow week can wreck your budget. And critics say this policy just doubles down on a broken system. It reinforces the idea that it's the customer's job to pay the worker's salary, not the employer's.
Which connects directly to this idea of tip fatigue.
It's a huge social phenomenon now. The data is just stark. 9 out of 10 Americans say they think tipping is completely out of control.
And this policy basically pours fuel on that fire.
It does, because it gives employers cover to keep paying a sub-minimum wage. They can say, well, you get to keep more of your tips now, so it all works out. It just entrenches the entire frustrating system.
Okay, so let's move to the other big labor incentive, The no tax on overtime provision. This isn't about tips. This is about rewarding someone who chooses to stay late or come in on a Saturday.
Right, and it follows the exact same philosophy. A direct, tangible reward for increasing your labor supply. And, like the tip deduction, it's also temporary, expiring at the end of 2028.
What are the numbers on this one?
It offers a tax deduction for up to $12,500 of qualified overtime pay. That doubles to $25,000 for a married couple filing jointly.
We have to define qualified overtime pay very carefully here, I imagine.
Yes, and this is the critical nuance that most people miss. The deduction applies only to the extra half-time pay premium.
The premium, what does that mean?
It's the and a half in time and a half. It's the extra amount required under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act for hours you work over 40. It does not apply to your full hourly rate for those overtime hours.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say your standard wage is $40 an hour. Your overtime rate is time and a half, so that's $60 an hour. The deduction does not apply to the full $60.
Okay. It only applies to the premium portion, which is that extra $20. So it's specifically targeting the financial incentive to work that extra hour, not your entire wage.
And I assume this is also phased out for higher earners.
Yes, same structure. It starts phasing out for individuals making $150,000 in modified adjusted gross income, and it's completely gone at $400,000. And again, just like the tips, FICA taxes, Social Security, and Medicare still apply. This is only a deduction against federal income tax.
So the real significance here is that if you're, say, a factory worker or a nurse pushing up against the 24% tax bracket, the decision to pick up an extra shift now feels much more rewarding. That extra money isn't just getting eaten by the tax man.
It provides immediate relief. And philosophically, it's a huge departure from policies that were criticized for, funding this ever-expanding welfare state with high marginal tax rates that basically punish extra effort. This is all about maximizing the reward for individual labor. So we've set up how the OBBA rewards new labor. Now let's look at how it defends the wealth that's already been created. This takes us to segment 2. Defending middle-class capital and family investment. When you say defending capital, it sounds aggressive, but what we're really talking about is a strategic choice to move away from those highly redistributive fiscal models we see in Europe.
That's the perfect way to frame it. The OBBA sees middle-class capital not as a pool of money to be taxed and reallocated by the government, but as a strategic asset for the household that needs to be protected.
And the first line of that defense is just stability.
Exactly. The first thing the law did was make several of the massive provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA, permanent. They were all set to expire at the end of 2025.
This was the so-called fiscal cliff everyone was worried about.
Right. The OBBA permanently extends the individual tax rates and, crucially, that much larger standard deduction.
That decision alone, just making those cuts permanent, must have a colossal price tag.
It's the single biggest driver of the bill's deficit impact. Just making the individual tax cuts permanent will cost an estimated $124 billion in lost revenue in the first 5 years alone.
Wow.
But the argument from supporters is that this provides essential long-term planning stability for millions of families and businesses, something the original TCJA, with its temporary individual cuts, never really did.
Stability at a steep price.
Okay,
now we have to get into the political deal-making, the battle over the SALT deduction.
Yes, state and local taxes. This was pure political horse trading.
The original TCJA capped that deduction at $10,000, which really hurt people in high-tax states.
Disproportionately hurt them, yes. So the OBBA dramatically increases that cap. It goes from $10,000 all the way up to $40,000 for taxpayers earning under $500,000.
$40,000? That's a huge jump. How did that get into the bill?
It was the price of passage. This was a deal cut with Republican representatives from places like New York, California, New Jersey. They refused to vote for the bill without it.
And the cost of that one concession?
An estimated $142 billion. But for those states, it was seen as essential. It protects their middle and high-income taxpayers from being double taxed, and it's a strategic move to prevent capital flight to stop wealthy residents from moving to lower tax states.
So without that deal, the entire OBBA probably would have failed.
Almost certainly. The vote was razor thin. It was a necessary sacrifice. But it's also important to note that increase is also temporary. The cap goes back to $10,000 after 5 years.
Kicking the can down the road.
Setting up the next big fiscal fight.
Okay, so let's pivot from protecting existing assets to building new generational wealth. This brings us to the Trump accounts. A totally new idea.
It's a fascinating experiment.
Yeah.
What's so revolutionary about these accounts, which are also temporary, by the way, is the direct government seeding. The federal government will deposit $1,000 for every U.S. citizen child born during that 4-year window.
So the government is literally giving newborns a stake in the stock market from day one.
An explicit state-backed jumpstart on market participation.
Yes. And what are the rules around these accounts? How do they encourage more savings?
The structure is all about encouraging broad, safe participation. Parents, grandparents, anyone can contribute up to $5,000 a year for the child. And employers are also incentivized to kick in up to $2,500 a year.
But the money can't just be gambled on anything, right?
Absolutely not. The rules are very strict. The funds have to be invested in low-cost mutual funds, or ETFs, that track a broad U.S. stock index, like the S&P 500.
So no crypto, no meme stocks.
No leverage, no high-fee products. The government is basically mandating that this money grows alongside the American economy as a whole.
And what happens when the child grows up?
The money grows tax-deferred, and then at age 18, the whole balance automatically rolls over into a traditional IRA. The goal is to create a whole cohort of young adults who have a meaningful amount of capital right as they're starting their careers.
It's an investment in future economic participation, but it's not cheap.
No, it's estimated to cost about $15.2 billion in lost revenue.
Beyond these new accounts, the OBBA also tweaked some existing family credits.
That's right, a broader focus on family finances. The child tax credit, which is hugely popular, was increased from $2,000 to $2,200 per child, and very importantly, it's now indexed to inflation.
So its real value won't get eroded over time.
Exactly. And we also saw a change to the adoption credit. Up to $5,000 of the total credit is now refundable.
Why is making it refundable so important?
Refundability means cash in hand. Adoptions are incredibly expensive, and the costs are all up front. If a credit isn't refundable, you only benefit if you have enough tax liability to offset. Making $5,000 of it refundable means a family can get that money back as a check from the government, regardless of their tax situation. It's immediate liquidity when they need it most.
The bill also goes after the childcare crisis, but by incentivizing employers.
And it's a massive push. This starts in 2026. The credit an employer can get for providing childcare help jumps from 25% up to 40% of their costs, and even higher for small businesses.
So the government is basically paying companies to help their employees with childcare?
Substantially. And the total credit an employer can claim goes way up to $500,000 a year. It's being framed as a strategic industrial policy. The idea is if you ease the childcare burden, you get more people, especially women, into the workforce, and that boosts productivity.
There's also a very specific temporary break for retirees in the bill. What's the goal there, and what's the trade-off?
This is a temporary deduction of up to $6,000 for seniors, and it phases out pretty quickly, over $75,000 in income. The stated goal, according to the Council of Economic Advisors, is to help 88% of seniors completely clear their Social Security tax burden.
Which sounds great for seniors today. What's the catch?
The catch is the Social Security Trust Fund. The taxes on Social Security benefits are a crucial revenue stream keeping that fund afloat. By cutting that revenue, critics immediately warn that this deduction will accelerate the date the trust fund becomes insolvent.
So you're giving a tax break to today's seniors by potentially shortening the solvency window for their kids and grandkids.
That's the stark philosophical trade-off, yes. Immediate popular benefit versus long-term systemic stability.
We see another one of these targeted deductions that's really about industrial policy, the one for U.S.-assembled car loans.
This is pure protectionism dressed up as a tax break. It's a temporary 4-year deduction of up to $10,000 in loan interest.
$10,000 is a lot of interest.
It is, but only if the new car you're buying had its final assembly in the United States. It's a very clear signal from the government to the consumer, buy American-made, and we'll help you pay for it.
Okay, and finally, let's just touch on the business tax stability provisions again, making the pass-through deduction permanent and changing the R&E expensing rules.
Right. For businesses, long-term stability is everything. The law makes that 20% deduction for pass-through businesses permanent, which helps millions of small and medium-sized companies. But the really big one for innovation is restoring the immediate expensing of domestic research and experimentation costs.
What does that mean, immediate expense?
Before, companies had to amortize those costs, meaning they had to spread out the tax deduction for their R&D spending over 5 years.
Which is a huge disincentive for a startup that's spending a ton of money now.
A massive disincentive. Restoring immediate expensing means a company can write off all of its domestic research costs in the same year they spend the money. It's a huge boost to cash flow and a massive incentive to keep R&D jobs and investment here in the U.S.
Okay, so segment 2 is clear. Defend wealth incentivize domestic investment, and stabilize American business. Now let's get to the most geopolitical part of the bill: restoring industrial sovereignty.
The energy policies in this bill aren't just about energy. They're designed as a geopolitical weapon. You have to remember, the U.S. already had a colossal energy price advantage over its competitors, especially the EU.
What did that advantage look like before this bill was even passed?
The numbers are pretty shocking. By 2024, wholesale natural gas in the EU was nearly 5 times more expensive than in the U.S.
5 times.
And industrial electricity was about 2.5 times more expensive. That cost difference is a direct manufacturing advantage. If you can power your factory for a fraction of what your German competitor pays, you're going to win.
So the OBBA was designed not just to keep that gap, but to actively make it wider.
Precisely. To deliberately prioritize a raw cost advantage, even at the expense of environmental goals. The explicit aim is to prevent the kind of deindustrialization that's happening in Europe right now because of high energy costs.
The administration signaled this from day one with the National Energy Emergency Declaration.
They did. That declaration was the legal justification they used to fast-track permits and slash regulations for all kinds of fossil fuel projects. The stated goal was to stabilize gas prices and create jobs in the oil and gas sector, and do it quickly.
And what specific measures in the OBBA actually boost fossil fuel production?
It's a long list. It includes allowing oil and gas exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which had been a political battle for decades.
It's a huge symbolic move.
Huge. The law also mandates quarterly onshore oil and gas lease sales. And on top of that, it significantly cuts the royalties and fees that the petroleum industry have to pay to operate on public lands.
How much did those royalty cuts actually cost the taxpayer?
The estimates are around $6 billion over a decade. And then there's a new, very targeted handout. A 2.5% tax credit for metallurgical coal.
That coal for making steel.
Right. And what's interesting is that 77% of that coal is exported. So the U.S. is now effectively subsidizing the global steel supply chain to give American coal producers an edge.
This all sounds like a complete 180-degree turn from the previous administration's climate agenda. Tell us about the degreening and the repeal of the IRA subsidies.
It is a systematic dismantling of nearly every clean energy tax credit that was in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. This is the hard break.
How fast is this happening? What's the timeline?
It's aggressive. The EV tax credits are one of the first to go. They're gone after September 2025. Then the tax credits for things like residential solar panels, wind turbines, energy-efficient home improvements, they all end on December 31st, 2025.
So a very quick phase out.
And beyond that, the law explicitly rescinds huge chunks of IRA funding. The money is just clawed back.
What kind of programs lost their funding?
Things like grants for home electrification. But the most symbolic cut was probably killing the EPA's Green Bank, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It sends a very clear message that the federal government is out of the business of financing the green transition.
So what's the long-term geopolitical risk here? If we're all in on cheap fossil fuels today, are we just handing the keys to the future to China?
That is the critical question. Many experts see this as voluntarily ceding future market dominance in sectors like clean energy and EVs, especially to Chinese firms. We get a massive short-term manufacturing cost advantage, no question. But we risk falling years behind in battery tech, solar manufacturing, grid storage, all the things that are going to drive the global economy for the next 50 years.
It's a huge strategic gamble. Okay, now let's talk about the other, less obvious industrial policy lever in this bill: immigration and border security.
Yes, this is the third leg of the stool. The OBBA ties national security directly to the economy with just gargantuan increases in funding for enforcement.
And the numbers for ICE are just astronomical.
They're unprecedented. The bill takes ICE's funding from about $10 billion and ramps it up to over $100 billion by 2029.
$100 billion. That makes it the single most funded federal law enforcement agency in the country. What is all that money for?
It's for a massive expansion of enforcement and detention capacity. $170 billion for border security, including over $46 billion for wall construction. But the key number is the $45 billion to add 100,000 new migrant detention beds.
And the goal of all that capacity?
The stated policy goal is to have the capacity to deport up to 1 million people a year.
1 million people a year. That kind of aggressive deportation, especially of agricultural workers, must create a massive labor shortage. How did the administration say they were going to fill that gap?
This is where it gets really controversial. The Secretary of Agriculture made a comment suggesting that able-bodied adults on Medicaid who are now subject to new work requirements under this law should go fill those farm jobs.
Wait, is that even realistic? Farm labor is brutal, specialized work.
That's the problem. The data from the Government Accountability Office shows that about 70% of adults on Medicaid and SNAP already work. They're the working poor. The number of Medicaid recipients who are actually able-bodied but long-term unemployed is tiny, maybe around 3%. The idea that this small group could replace a massive, experienced farm labor force was, well, it was widely seen as logistically absurd and politically inflammatory.
So a three-pronged approach to sovereignty: cheap fossil fuels, protectionist incentives, and a radical immigration enforcement strategy. Now we have to talk about what all of this actually costs. This brings us to the final segment: the fiscal picture, the social cost, and the political reality. We've talked a lot about the goals and the incentives in the OBBA, but the nonpartisan numbers, especially from the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they tell a very different story about the bill's true cost.
The CBO estimates are the unavoidable reality check. All these tax cuts, the new spending on enforcement, the CBO projects this law will increase the budget deficit by $2.8 trillion by 2034.
$2.8 trillion.
And that number is why Moody's, the last of the big three credit agencies, finally downgraded U.S. debt. It was a signal of global concern about America's fiscal path.
And this leads right to the biggest critique of the bill, that for all the talk about rewarding the hustle, it's actually the biggest upward transfer of wealth in modern history. What did the CBO find on that?
The CBO's distribution analysis was stark. The top 10% of earners see their incomes go up by 2.7% by 2034, mostly from the permanent tax cuts.
And
The bottom 10% of earners see their incomes fall by 3.1%. And that drop is directly because of the deep cuts to the social safety net programs that were made to help pay for everything else.
That is a shocking reversal of the bill's public message. No wonder it got that nickname.
The reverse Robin Hood bill. Yes, that moniker popped up everywhere. The Atlantic, CNBC, Vox. Analysts argued it was the textbook definition of regressive fiscal policy, taking from the poor to give permanent tax breaks to the wealthy.
So let's detail those cuts, starting with Medicaid. These were historic in scale.
The largest cuts in the program's history. Over $1.2 trillion in federal spending cut from Medicaid. The direct result, according to the CBO, is that 10.9 million Americans will lose their health insurance.
10.9 million people, just an incredible number. How does the bill actually achieve that? What are the mechanisms?
The main driver is new mandatory work requirements. For the first time, recipients between 19 and 64 have to prove they're working, training, or volunteering for at least 80 hours a month. If you can't, you lose your coverage. Simple as that.
And what's the ripple effect of suddenly having almost 11 million more uninsured people on the healthcare system?
It's systemic, especially for rural areas. Rural hospitals, which already run on razor-thin margins, were warned they face a severe risk of closing. They're the ones who have to absorb the cost of treating all these new uninsured patients.
And the cuts didn't stop with healthcare. They went after food assistance, too, with SNAP.
Correct. Federal nutrition funding was cut by $186 billion over the decade. And just like with Medicaid, they expanded the work requirements. But they also did something else. They shifted the administrative costs onto the states.
What does that mean?
It means states now have to pay 75% of the cost of running the SNAP program, up from 50%. This creates a huge disincentive for states to run the program well. They might cut outreach or make it harder to apply just to save on their own administrative budget. It's a way for the federal government to shrink the program by offloading the cost.
The combined impact of these cuts led to some really dire warnings from public health experts.
They did. Researchers from Yale and UPenn put out a joint statement warning that the combined cuts in this bill could lead to over 51,000 preventable deaths a year.
51,000.
It just shows you the high-stakes gamble this bill represents. You're balancing the potential for economic stimulus against a profound human cost.
And despite all that, or maybe because of it, the bill had a huge PR problem from the start.
A massive image issue. The cuts were just so unpopular. That Fox News poll showing 59% of Americans oppose the law was a real shock to its supporters. The complexity of it made it an easy target.
Even some conservative-leaning groups like the Tax Foundation weren't fully on board.
Their review was scathing in a way. They liked the permanence of the TCJA cuts, the stability, but they called the tax breaks for tips and overtime gimmicks. They argued these temporary populist deductions just made the tax code more complex and incoherent. They saw it as a messy mix of real supply-side policy and short-term political handouts paid for by cutting services to the poor.
And that brings us to the political drama with Elon Musk, a high-profile ally who turned on the bill.
It was a genuine rupture. Musk, who was a huge donor, publicly called the OBBA a disgusting abomination. His issue was the $2.8 trillion deficit increase. It completely violated his fiscally conservative libertarian principles. His opposition really highlighted the deep fractures this bill created, even within the conservative movement.
The whole story, the social costs, the political drama, it really just underscores that this wasn't a normal piece of legislation. It was a fundamental restructuring.
And that connects back to the big picture.
Yeah.
This act isn't just a policy document, it's a declaration. It systematically incentivizes labor and fossil fuel-powered industry, and it pays for it by cutting the safety net and ramping up immigration enforcement. It permanently changes the foundations of American taxation, energy, and our entire social contract.
The U.S. has raised the debt ceiling by $5 trillion to make this happen, choosing a path of growth through incentive and deregulation. It is a hard, definitive break from that European social democratic model that Pierre, my bureaucrat friend in Brussels, represents. The OBBA accepts all the massive fiscal and social risks we've talked about, and in doing so, it forces a very clear question upon the Western world. Is the future of a developed nation defined by the comfort of collective protection, or is it defined by the relentless, untaxed reward of individual hustle?